Tonight, you're travelling back to a world before cities, before castles, before kings ruled from stone halls, to the quiet moment when humanity first learned to plant seeds and wait. It sounds simple, but farming changed everything. It created villages, wealth, armies, trade, and the medieval world itself. And honestly, without it, most of us probably wouldn't survive a single winter out there. So before we step into the muddy roads, smoky hearths, and frost-covered fields of medieval life, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy these slow historical journeys. Now, dim the lights, settle in beside the fire, and let's wander into the story of how farming quietly became humanity's greatest turning point. Hey guys! Tonight you find yourself standing ankle-deep in cold mud outside the timber palisade while a winter wind creeps beneath your cloak like an unpaid tax collector. Smoke drifts from crooked chimneys into a sky the colour of old iron, and somewhere beyond the walls a monastery bell hums through the dusk, slow and heavy enough to make even the crows sound thoughtful. Your boots are soaked already. Damp straw clings to the hem of your tunic. Horsebreath ghosts white through the freezing air near the gatehouse, while torchlight flickers against wet stone and puddles that smell faintly of manure and wood smoke. Medieval travel brochures really oversold this experience. A guard squints at you from beneath a fur-lined hood with all the warmth of a disappointed innkeeper. Behind him, the village presses close together beneath soot-dark rafters and sagging roofs, every house leaning slightly as if exhausted from surviving another winter. You probably would not last a week out here, honestly. The cold alone seems personally offended by your existence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in tonight, feel free to comment your location and local time as these bells ring somewhere far across the darkening fields. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The gate finally groans open after the guard finishes examining you with the suspicion medieval people reserve for strangers, tax collectors, and suspiciously cheerful monks. You duck beneath the heavy oak beam and step into the village proper, where rushes lie scattered across stone floors to soak up mud, spilled ale, and whatever else life happens to drip indoors during winter. The place smells of wet wool, smoke, onions, and coarse bread. Not good bread either, dense bread capable of surviving minor warfare. A dog watches you from beneath a cart with one ear bent sideways like a broken weather vane. It decides, for reasons known only to dogs and perhaps saints, that you belong to it now. So it follows behind as you walk deeper into the narrow lane between timber houses. Everywhere around you, farming clings to life even in winter's grip. Bundles of dried onions hang from rafters beneath little charms made of twisted straw. Barrels of salted fish stand beside sacks of grain carefully raised above damp floors. Chickens scratch between puddles, while a woman empties grey dishwater into the street with the casual confidence of someone who knows nobody will complain because everyone else is doing exactly the same thing. No one can quite agree whether villages like this truly remember the first days of farming or merely tell themselves they do. But the people here speak of the earth the way sailors speak of the sea, with dependence, resentment, fear, and strange affection all tangled together. You pass a blacksmith's shed glowing orange through the gloom. Sparks leap upward while the smith hammers iron slowly, methodically, as though winter itself might crack if struck hard enough. Beside the forge hangs a horseshoe painted with soot and goose fat. Some swear that hanging a treated horseshoe above a doorway keeps wandering spirits from souring milk or spoiling grain stores. Others insist it only attracts thieves looking for iron. Even now, it is hard to tell whether anyone truly believes these things or simply fears the risk of not believing them. Ahead, the village widens into a muddy square where a shallow market stands mostly abandoned for the evening. Empty stalls creak beneath damp canvas roofs. A few merchants still linger beside carts of turnips, smoked eel, and rough wool cloaks. One old trader warms his hands above a tiny brazier while loudly claiming his onions cure winter fevers, bad lungs, weak marriages, and possibly demonic possession. You suspect the onions mainly smell powerful enough to frighten illness away voluntarily. Near the well at the square's centre, several villagers gather beside a cart piled with sacks of barley. The grain is covered carefully with waxed cloth, despite the rain having nearly stopped. You notice immediately how protective everyone becomes around those sacks. Eyes follow them constantly and hands rest nearby. Even the carter sleeps perched atop the load with a cudgel across his lap. Gold matters to kings, grain matters to everyone else. A monastery bell tolls again somewhere beyond the fields. The sound carries strangely through the cold evening air, rolling across muddy lanes and frozen puddles before fading into the distant dark. The villagers pause almost without thinking. A woman mutters a prayer. A child crosses himself backward by mistake and gets corrected immediately by his grandmother with the speed of long practice. Time here belongs less to clocks than to bells, weather, and harvests. You continue through the square while the loyal dog trots behind. A pair of oxen stand near a stable chewing slowly beneath blankets of steaming breath. Massive creatures, calm creatures, creatures that look capable of pulling the moon itself across a field if asked politely enough. And tomorrow, before dawn fully breaks, they will drag ploughs through frozen earth. That is the strange thing you begin noticing here. Farming never truly stops. Even in winter, even in mud, even beneath cold rain and smoky skies, every thought bends quietly toward the next growing season. Repairs must be made, seeds protected, tools sharpened, storehouses guarded, fields remembered beneath frost. You pass an old woman sitting beneath a tiny shrine to a weathered saint whose face has nearly vanished from wind and rain. She cradles a bundle of dried herbs in one hand while murmuring softly over them. Some swear charms buried at the corners of fields protect crops from blight. Others blame failed harvests on offended saints, wandering spirits, or neighbours with suspiciously healthy cabbages. Medieval farming involves an impressive amount of guessing. At the edge of the square, you finally find shelter inside a low alehouse, whose crooked sign swings miserably in the wind. Warmth rushes over you immediately as you duck through the door. Not clean warmth, of course. Medieval warmth arrives flavoured with smoke, wet wool, stale ale, damp dogs, and humanity packed shoulder to shoulder beneath soot-black beams. Still, compared to outside, it feels heavenly. Rushes crackle beneath your boots. Beeswax candles flicker against warped wooden walls. Somewhere near the hearth, a tired man plucks lazily at a lute missing at least one string and possibly several ambitions. You settle near the fire while the dog collapses beside your feet, with the dramatic sigh of a creature burdened by profound responsibilities. Around you, villagers eat pottage from wooden bowls thick enough to stand spoons upright. Coarse bread tears loudly in rough hands. Ale sloshes. Someone coughs into the rushes. Someone else argues about whether early frost means a good spring or an angry one. And slowly, as the fire pops and monastery bells echo faintly through the dark beyond the walls, you begin to understand the quiet change that reshaped everything long before castles rose or kings claimed crowns. Not swords, not gold, not war, Fields. Simple furrows cut into damp earth by tired hands. Because once people learned how to make the land feed them reliably, or at least slightly less unreliably, the whole world began settling into place around those fields. Villages formed, granaries filled, roads appeared, markets followed. Lords claimed land, monasteries counted harvests, bells marked labour, armies marched on stored grain, all from seeds pressed quietly into soil. The fire settles lower beside you. Outside, the winter wind moves softly along the walls of the village. Somewhere in the dark fields beyond, hidden beneath frost and mud, tomorrow's planting waits patiently for human hands once more. And the bell tolls again. Morning arrives reluctantly, not with golden sunlight or cheerful bird song, but with grey mist pressing low over the village and the smell of damp ashes drifting through cracks in the alehouse shutters. Somewhere nearby, a rooster attempts optimism and is answered immediately by a man shouting at it to keep quiet. Medieval mornings possess very little romance once you actually experience them. You wake stiff beneath a wool blanket that feels woven from equal parts sheep and regret. The dog still sleeps beside the hearth, twitching occasionally as though chasing rabbits in dreams far more pleasant than reality. Around the room, a few villagers already sit hunched over bowls of steaming pottage while beeswax candles gutter weakly against the dawn gloom. The monastery bell sounds again beyond the fields. Slow. Measured. A sound that seems less like music and more like the earth reminding everyone to get back to work. You step outside into air sharp enough to sting your teeth. Frost silvers the muddy lane. Thin smoke rises from chimneys into a pale sky while villagers emerge wrapped in cloaks and patched hoods, their breath drifting white around them. A cartwheel groans somewhere ahead. Oxen snort heavily in the cold. And already the village moves toward the fields. You follow the slow procession beyond the timber gate where narrow paths wind between strips of frozen earth, stretching outward into the mist. The land lies divided into long open furrows, each strip belonging to different families though no fences mark them clearly. One patch dark and freshly turned, another pale with frost, another sleeping beneath winter stubble. Rainwater glimmers in the tracks left by wagon wheels. Ahead, 2 oxen wait beneath leather harnesses while a ploughman adjusts the iron blade with numb fingers. His beard carries tiny flecks of frost. Beside him stands a boy barely old enough to manage the guiding stick in his hands. No one can quite agree whether children learn farming or simply absorb it from the ground itself. By the time they can properly lift a bucket, they already know weather signs, planting rhythms, and the exact expression adults make when hail destroys barley. The ploughman notices you watching and nods once before spitting into the dirt thoughtfully. "Ground's stubborn today," he mutters. The oxen probably feel the same. They begin moving with enormous patience, hooves sinking deep into wet soil while the plough groans behind them. Earth folds slowly aside in dark ribbons. Steam rises faintly where frozen crust breaks open beneath iron. It is difficult work to watch quietly, not dramatic work, not heroic in the way wandering singers prefer, just slow, relentless effort repeated season after season until entire civilizations rise from it almost accidentally. You walk beside the furrow while the ploughman guides the blade carefully. Every few passes he pauses to clear tangled roots from the iron tip. The boy scatters handfuls of old ash into stubborn patches of ground because his grandmother swears ashes wake sleeping soil. Some swear burying an egg beneath the first furrow ensures healthy crops. Others insist the earth dislikes eggs entirely and prefers milk. Even now, it is hard to tell where farming ends and ritual begins. Further along the fields, Other villagers work quietly despite the cold. Women gather stones into baskets to clear planting strips. An old man repairs a broken fence post using twine and curses old enough to qualify as historical artifacts. Children chase crows from newly turned ground by rattling bits of scrap iron tied to sticks. The crows seem entirely unconvinced. A sharp wind crosses the fields carrying the smell of wet soil and distant wood smoke. Somewhere farther off, another bell answers the monastery's call, faint as memory through the mist. The ploughman finally stops beside a patch of darker earth and kneels stiffly. He scoops a handful of soil into cracked hands, rubbing it thoughtfully between thumb and finger. There, he says softly, better, as though the ground itself has moods requiring negotiation. Perhaps it does. You continue walking through the open fields while dawn slowly brightens from iron grey toward pale silver. Frost melts from dead grasses. Ravens circle lazily overhead. In the distance, a line of women carries baskets toward a communal oven near the village edge where coarse loaves already bake beneath rising smoke. Everything here bends toward bread eventually. The grain becomes flour. The flour becomes dough. The dough becomes survival. A young monk appears along the field path carrying a satchel almost larger than himself. His boots are caked in mud to the ankle, and his nose glows pink from cold. He stops beside several workers and distributes tiny strips of cloth marked with faded prayers. Field charms. The villagers tuck them into belts or hang them near harnesses with quiet seriousness. Some swear written prayers help wheat survive blight. Others claim saints ignore crops entirely because they are busy handling plagues, storms, and kings making terrible decisions. Still, nobody refuses the charms. Medieval people generally prefer not offending heaven unnecessarily. The monk offers one to you as well. It smells faintly of candle smoke and old ink. You tuck it into your sleeve mostly because refusing gift from cold monks at dawn feels like tempting fate in very specific ways. Nearby, the oxen begin moving again, slow, patient, eternal. The rhythm settles into the morning itself, creaking harnesses, distant crows, boots through mud, bells across the fields. Farming rarely looks important in the moment. That may be why it changes the world so completely. It does not arrive dramatically. It arrives furrow by furrow. You reach the crest of a low hill where the entire valley spreads below, and suddenly the shape of everything becomes visible. The village huddles at the centre beside a narrow river. Beyond it stretch fields divided into long strips like pieces of rough cloth sewn together. Smoke rises from cottages. Roads wind outward toward distant forests and monasteries. Tiny figures move behind ploughs across the earth. Nothing here exists without those fields. Not the alehouse fire. Not the bells. Not the walls. Not the monks copying books by candlelight. Not the lord collecting rents from frightened peasants. The fields feed them all. A cold drizzle begins falling just before midday, thin and miserable enough to soak everything without possessing the decency to become proper rain. Cloaks darken, boots sink deeper into mud. The ploughman only grunts and keeps working because medieval farmers treat discomfort the way ducks treat ponds. The boy guiding the oxen slips once and nearly falls face first into a furrow. The oxen barely notice. To be fair, they have likely seen worse. You help gather tools beneath a rough shelter of timber poles while villagers eat a midday meal of bread, onions, and smoked fish wrapped in cloth. Someone passes you weak ale in a wooden cup. It tastes faintly of barley and strong opinions. Conversation drifts lazily through the rain. A woman worries about mould in the grain stores. An old man predicts harsh frost because his knee aches. Another villager claims he saw foxfire glowing blue over the marshes last night. which supposedly means either good harvests or wandering dead depending on who tells the tale. Those who tell the tale never fully agree. The dog appears again from absolutely nowhere and receives several crusts of bread as though this has always been its rightful profession. Rain taps softly against the shelter roof while the workers rest their hands for a few precious moments. You notice how exhausted everyone looks already despite the day barely reaching midday. Farming is not simply labour, it is repetition. Endless repetition measured by seasons instead of hours. Plough, plant, wait, harvest, store, survive winter, begin again, and somewhere beneath that rhythm, humanity quietly changes forever. Because once people tie themselves to fields, they stop wandering quite so much. Villages deepen roots, boundaries appear, ownership matters, storehouses need guarding, harvests create wealth, wealth attracts power, all from seeds and mud. The drizzle finally eases, one by one. The villagers rise again without complaint, harnesses creak back into place, hands grip wooden tools worn smooth by generations. And beneath the pale winter sky, the furrows continue slowly cutting across the earth. By late afternoon, the cold rain has faded into a thin silver mist drifting low across the valley. The fields behind you glisten darkly beneath the pale sky, while the muddy paths leading toward the monastery grow slick beneath your boots. The dog still follows, of course. At this point you suspect it has appointed itself your spiritual advisor. Its qualifications remain questionable. You walk beside the young monk from earlier, who introduces himself only as Brother Aldrich before immediately apologizing for talking too much, then continuing to talk anyway. His robe smells faintly of damp wool, candle smoke, and herbs crushed somewhere inside the satchel bumping against his side. The abbey keeps the best seed grain in the valley, he says proudly while guiding you along the winding road, or so the abbot claims whenever visitors arrive. And when visitors leave, Brother Aldrich sighs, then he says mice ate half of it. Ahead. The monastery emerges slowly through the mist like something half-remembered from a dream. Thick stone walls rise above bare winter orchards. A squat bell tower looms over tiled roofs slick with rain. Smoke curls upward from chimneys while narrow windows glow amber against the approaching dusk. The bells begin ringing again as you approach. Closer now. Deeper. The sound settles into your chest like a second heartbeat. Monasteries mark time differently from villages. Every hour belongs to prayer, labour, study, or silence. Even the bells seem to move carefully through the day, as though afraid to wake the saints. A lay brother opens the gate after inspecting you with practised suspicion. Monasteries welcome travellers, certainly, but medieval hospitality usually comes wrapped in mild distrust and several questions about whether you carry fleas. You pass into the courtyard where chickens wander between puddles beside stacks of chopped firewood. An old mule blinks at you mournfully beneath the dripping awning. Near the well, two novices scrub muddy turnips in icy water while trying very hard not to splash each other like children. They fail immediately. Brother Aldrich leads you through a low oak door into warmth thick with the smell of parchment, smoke, and boiled cabbage. Candles flicker along stone corridors while distant chanting hums somewhere deeper within the abbey. The sound is strangely comforting. Not joyful exactly, just steady, like rain against windows. Rushes soften the cold floors beneath your boots as you follow the monk into the refectory where several brothers eat supper quietly from wooden trenchers, coarse bread, onion pottage, tiny pieces of smoked eel reserved carefully enough to suggest either holiness or strict budgeting. A few monks glance up as you enter, most return immediately to eating. One elderly brother continues staring openly at the dog. "No dogs in the library again," he mutters. The dog looks entirely unrepentant. You settle beside the fire while Brother Aldrich disappears briefly, returning moments later carrying a thick heel of dark bread still warm from the ovens. Real monastery bread, dense enough to support architecture, but surprisingly good beneath the crust. "You are fortunate," he whispers. "Yesterday's loaf nearly injured a pilgrim." Outside, twilight thickens across the abbey grounds while bells echo through the damp evening air. Somewhere beyond the walls, farmers still work the last fading light, their fields stretching dark beneath gathering mist. Even here inside stone walls, farming follows everyone. The abbey survives because grain fills its storehouses, because orchards produce fruit, because peasants deliver rents in barley, oats, and winter wheat. Prayer may guide the monastery, but bread keeps it standing. After supper, Brother Aldrich leads you through winding corridors toward the scriptorium. The room glows softly with beeswax candles and tiny oil lamps suspended from iron hooks. Ink-stained scribes bend silently over parchment sheets, while goose feathers scratch across vellum in delicate rhythms. The smell here is remarkable. Warm wax, old leather, dust, ink, and faintly beneath it all, dried herbs stored to keep insects away from precious manuscripts. One monk carefully copies rows of Latin text while another illustrates curling vines around a saint's robe using powdered minerals bright as jewels. Nearby, a younger scribe yawns so widely you briefly fear he may swallow his own quill. No one can quite agree whether copying books is holy discipline or slow punishment, Brother Aldrich murmurs. The young scribe accidentally splatters ink across his sleeve at that exact moment, which feels like partial confirmation. At the far end of the room, several shelves hold clay jars sealed tightly with wax. Brother Aldrich lowers his voice immediately as you approach them. "The seed stores," he says. Inside the jars rest carefully protected grains gathered over generations: rye, barley, oats, winter wheat, peas, each labelled in cramped handwriting, each guarded almost as carefully as saints' relics. Some seeds come from distant valleys, some from forgotten harvests long ago, some from fields that no longer exist. The monks preserve them with astonishing seriousness because famine never drifts far from medieval memory. One failed harvest can hollow entire villages, two can empty roads completely. So the abbey watches over seeds, quietly, patiently, as though safeguarding tiny sleeping kingdoms. Brother Aldrich opens one jar carefully and pours several grains into his palm. Tiny things, dry, unremarkable, and yet entire lives depend upon them. Some swear certain seeds grow better after being blessed beside relics, he says softly. Others believe moonlight strengthens spring grain. Do you believe that? He considers for a moment. I believe hungry people try everything. Fair enough. Outside, wind rattles faintly against the shutters while candles flicker across rows of manuscripts. The scribes continue working in near silence, except for scratching quills and the occasional muttered prayer after mistakes. You notice tiny drawings hidden in the margins of one parchment: rabbits wearing crowns, birds carrying swords, a cat chasing what appears to be an unusually angry snail. Medieval monks become surprisingly strange after enough candlelit hours indoors. Brother Aldrich notices your expression and quickly closes the manuscript. Brother Petrus spends too much time near the mushroom gardens, he explains carefully. Eventually the evening prayers begin, and the bells roll once more through the monastery. You follow the monks into the chapel where cold stone pillars rise into shadow above flickering candles. Incense drifts softly through the dim air while chants echo beneath vaulted ceilings like distant waves. You sit quietly near the back. Beyond stained glass windows, darkness settles over the valley. Somewhere out there, villagers close shutters against the cold. Fires burn low inside timber cottages. Oxen sleep in warm stables beside stacked hay. Hidden beneath frost and soil, the fields wait for spring. And here within the monastery seeds wait too, protected from damp, protected from mice, protected as much as possible from bad seasons and human foolishness. Though history suggests human foolishness remains extremely difficult to guard against. After prayers, you help Brother Aldrich carry fresh rushes into the guest house chamber where travellers sleep beside a small hearth. The room contains little beyond straw mattresses, wool blankets, and a wooden crucifix darkened by smoke. Simple, cold, peaceful. A candle burns low beside the door while wind hums faintly beyond the shutters. The dog circles twice before collapsing heavily near the hearth with the weary dignity of a knight returning from battle. Brother Aldrich pauses before leaving. "You know," he says quietly, "people speak often of kings changing the world, armies, battles, great fires." He glances toward the distant granaries barely visible through the dark window. "But most lives change because someone planted enough grain the year before." Then he smiles faintly and disappears into the corridor. The candle flame trembles softly. Outside, monastery bells mark another passing hour while winter mist drifts silently over the sleeping fields, and somewhere inside thick stone walls nearby, countless seeds rest in darkness, waiting patiently to shape the future one harvest at a time. The monastery wakes long before sunrise. Her bell crashes through the darkness with the subtle grace of a blacksmith dropping cookware down a staircase. And suddenly the abbey stirs around you. Footsteps scrape along stone corridors. Doors creak. Somewhere nearby, someone coughs with the determination of a man arguing directly with winter itself. You lie beneath rough wool blankets listening to the cold wind push softly against the shutters. The guest house hearth has dwindled into red embers. Beside it, the dog opens one eye, decides the world remains unpleasantly early, and goes back to sleep immediately. A wise creature. Outside, the valley still sleeps beneath darkness and frost, but monastery life moves according to bells rather than comfort. Monks shuffle through dim corridors carrying candles that paint wavering gold across damp stone walls. The air smells of smoke, old wax and wet wool drying too slowly, too. Brother Aldrich appears at your doorway holding a lantern and looking far too awake for this hour. "The market town opens at dawn," he whispers. "The abbey sends grain there before the roads worsen." You suspect the roads are already in active rebellion against human movement. Still, you follow him into the courtyard where several lay brothers load sacks of barley onto a pair of wagons. Frost crackles beneath boots. Oxen stamp heavily in the cold, while steam rises from their backs into the dark air. Lantern light flickers across ropes, harnesses, and stacks of bundled grain carefully wrapped beneath waxed cloth. Every sack matters. One torn bag means lost flour. Lost flour means thinner bread. Thinner bread means hungry tempers. And medieval people become surprisingly dramatic when hungry. The eastern horizon slowly pales as the wagons creak through the monastery gates onto the road toward town. You walk beside the first cart while Brother Aldrich mutters prayers whenever wheels slide dangerously near muddy ditches. The dog trots proudly ahead like an exceptionally underqualified scout. The road winds through sleeping farmland silvered with frost. Bare orchards stretch beside frozen ponds. Thin smoke rises from scattered cottages where farmers already stir beside morning fires. In distant fields, dark shapes move slowly early plough teams beginning another day before dawn fully breaks. No one can quite agree whether medieval farmers sleep lightly from discipline or simply because oxen and weather refuse to respect normal human schedules. As morning grows brighter, the town finally appears ahead. Stone walls rise above the river crossing, patched in places where age and weather have chewed patiently at the mortar. Timber watchtowers lean slightly outward over the muddy approach road. A line of travellers already crowds the gate merchants with wool bales, peasants carrying baskets of eggs, pilgrims wrapped in patched cloaks, and one extremely nervous man transporting geese in a wicker crate. The geese seem furious about commerce in general. A gate guard collects tolls beneath a striped awning while scribes nearby scratch records into wax tablets with sleepy concentration. Everyone entering the town pays something: grain, coins, salt, cloth. Civilization, you begin noticing, involves a tremendous amount of standing in line while cold officials inspect things. Brother Aldrich hands over the monastery seal, and the guards wave the grain wagons through with respectful nods. Monasteries hold influence here. Not merely spiritual influence either, bread influence. And bread influence is extremely persuasive. Inside the walls, the town already hums with life despite the early hour. Narrow streets twist between overhanging timber houses, whose upper floors nearly touch above the muddy lanes. Rainwater drips from crooked gutters. Shopkeepers unlatch shutters while apprentices sweep yesterday's filth into the street with deeply unconvincing enthusiasm. The market square opens suddenly before you, and it is alive. Not loud in the modern sense. Medieval noise feels thicker somehow. Wagon wheels grinding against stone, horses snorting, merchants shouting prices through scarves wrapped against the cold, bells ringing from nearby chapels, hammers clanging somewhere beyond the square, voices blending into one enormous restless murmur beneath the pale morning sky. The smell arrives next. Fresh bread, fish, smoke, wet wool, tallow candles, alaire, turnips, and humanity compressed tightly together. Market stalls spread across the square beneath patched canvas roofs. Some sell onions, beans, smoked eel, and winter apples wrinkled slightly with age. Others display iron nails, wool gloves, pilgrim badges, clay pots, ribbons, candles, herbs, and tiny carved saints no bigger than your thumb. At the centre stands the grain market. You understand immediately why Brother Aldrich came. Here, farming becomes power you can actually see. Sacks of barley and wheat stack beneath guarded awnings while merchants examine grains with astonishing seriousness. Fingers sift kernels carefully. Weights balance on brass scales. Arguments erupt over moisture, quality, transport costs, and rumours of poor harvests farther north. One merchant bites a grain thoughtfully as though tasting wine. Another sniffs flour with the solemn concentration of a priest interpreting prophecy. The abbey's grain receives immediate attention. Buyers gather quickly around the wagons while scribes record quantities into ledgers stained with ink and old rain. Coins clink softly into lockboxes. Not many coins, but enough. Enough to repair roofs. Enough to buy candles. Enough to survive another winter. You wander through the square while the trading continues behind you. Everywhere, the connection between farming and daily life reveals itself more clearly. A baker kneads dough beside a public oven where heat billows into the freezing air. A brewer unloads barley sacks beside steaming vats. A cooper repairs cracked grain barrels near the fountain. Even the wool merchants depend upon sheep fed from harvested fields. The whole town rests upon the stored harvest whether anyone notices or not. A man beside a spice stall waves you closer conspiratorially and offers a tiny pouch meant to protect grain stores from rats. What's inside, you ask? He lowers his voice. Mostly mint. And the rest? Optimism. Reasonable enough. Near the far edge of the market square, several women gather around a public grain measurer seated beneath a painted wooden sign. Farmers bring sacks here to be weighed fairly before sale. In theory. In practice, the measurer possesses the slippery confidence of a man who has spent decades arguing about barley quantities. No one can quite agree whether old Mathis cheats customers, Brother Aldrich murmurs beside you, mostly because he cheats everyone equally. Old Maths overhears this and glares without pausing his measurements. You watch villagers exchange grain for salt, cloth, lamp oil, tools, and dried fish from distant coasts. Farming no longer merely feeds families here. It creates trade itself. Surplus grain means specialization. Bakers bake. Smiths forge iron. Scribes copy books. Merchants travel roads. Because somebody else grew enough food. A group of children rushes past carrying hot trenchers piled with fresh oatcakes toward a nearby tavern. The smell nearly stops you where you stand. Warm bread in winter possesses almost supernatural emotional power. Even the dog looks spiritually transformed. Brother Aldrich eventually finishes the monastery business and joins you beside the fountain where thin ice clings stubbornly to the stone edges. Funny thing, he says while watching the market bustle around you. People think towns create wealth. He gestures toward the grain wagons. But towns only gather what fields already made possible. The square continues moving endlessly around you farmers unloading barley, bakers carrying loaves, scribes counting tolls, merchants shouting prices beneath fluttering banners, all of it flowing outward from the quiet labour of muddy fields beyond the walls. A bell rings overhead from the town chapel. Mid-morning already? The crowd shifts restlessly beneath drifting chimney smoke while cold sunlight finally breaks through the clouds, pale and thin across the market roofs. And for a brief moment, standing amid grain dust and winter breath and the endless murmur of trade, you can almost see humanity itself changing shape around these harvests. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just steadily. Like a town growing stone by stone beside a road that once crossed only empty fields. By the time you leave the market square, the pale winter sun hangs weakly above the town walls like a candle struggling through fog. The roads have worsened into thick brown ribbons of mud churned by carts, hooves, and far too many optimistic pedestrians. Brother Aldrich leads you uphill through narrower streets where wealth begins revealing itself carefully, one timber beam at a time. The houses here stand taller. The shutters fit properly, and remarkably few chickens wander indoors. You pass beneath an archway guarded by 2 men-at-arms wrapped in wool cloaks and rust-flecked mail. Their spears glisten damply in the cold air, while behind them rises the manor hall overlooking the town and surrounding fields. Not a grand castle exactly. More the sort of fortified residence built by someone who wishes to remind peasants who owns the nearby land without paying for full towers. Smoke drifts from its chimneys into the pale sky. A stable boy rushes past carrying a sack of oats nearly his own size. Somewhere beyond the courtyard walls comes the sharp ring of metal striking metal, while servants haul water buckets through slush and barking dogs dart beneath wagon wheels. Even here, farming surrounds everything. You enter the great hall through heavy oak doors banded with black iron. Warmth crashes over you immediately, thick with the smell of roasting onions, damp wool, beeswax, smoke, and humanity living too close together through winter. Rushes cover the floor beneath long wooden tables scarred by years of knives, boots, and spilled ale. Tallow candles flicker against soot-dark rafters where smoke curls lazily upward before escaping through narrow roof vents. Along the walls hang faded banners embroidered with hunting scenes, saints, and one extremely heroic-looking boar. The boar appears deeply committed to its career. Servants move constantly through the hall carrying trenchers, pitchers, and baskets of coarse bread while several hounds sleep beneath benches in strategic positions, likely chosen after generations of falling scraps. A steward greets Brother Aldrich with weary familiarity and guides you toward places near the hearth. "The Lord dines shortly," he says, and complains shortly after that, as tradition demands. You settle onto a bench while warmth slowly returns to your hands. Nearby, several peasants wait nervously beside sacks of grain and bundles of records tied with cord. Rent collections. Here is where farming reveals another transformation quietly shaping the medieval world once fields produce regular harvests. Somebody eventually decides those harvests belong partly to them. Usually someone wearing fur. At the high table, servants arrange polished cups beside loaves of dark bread and steaming bowls of thick pottage. Nothing luxurious by royal standards, perhaps, but compared to village meals, the difference feels unmistakable. More meat, better ale, fewer suspicious onions. The Lord finally enters with little ceremony, wrapped in a fur-lined mantle and followed by two sleepy-looking retainers. He's not especially old, though worry and winter have pressed hard against his face. A silver key hangs at his belt beside a dagger worn smooth from use. Storehouse keys, more important than swords during bad harvests. He greets Brother Aldrich politely before sinking into his chair with the exhausted sigh of a man personally burdened by weather, taxes, and human incompetence. Which, to be fair, he probably is. The meal begins quickly. Servants distribute trenchers piled with pottage thickened from barley and leeks, while coarse bread passes from hand to hand. A roasted capon appears at the high table, though farther down the hall most people receive salted fish instead. Status, it turns out, can often be measured by proximity to poultry. As you eat, peasants approach the steward one by one carrying records of rents owed from surrounding fields. Some pay in coin, most pay in grain, beans, wool, or labour promised for spring ploughing. Everything traces back to the land. One farmer kneels beside the table explaining anxiously that flooding ruined part of his barley strip before harvest. Another requests permission to graze sheep longer on the common meadow. The steward records each matter carefully onto parchment while the Lord listens with half-closed eyes. No one can quite agree whether manor courts exist mainly to maintain order or simply to ensure someone official hears every complaint in the valley. Probably both. A thin woman carrying a basket of eggs approaches nervously next. She offers part of her winter hen's yield as rent payment, while apologizing repeatedly because 2 eggs cracked during transport. The steward barely glances up. "Still usable," he says. A servant immediately carries the cracked eggs toward the kitchens with remarkable speed. Nothing goes to waste here. Not grain husks. Not stale bread. Not even cracked eggs in winter. The Lord finally speaks while tearing apart a piece of dark rye loaf. Hard frost came early, he mutters to Brother Aldrich. If spring rain fails too, next year will bite. The monk nods quietly. You notice how even wealthy households remain uneasy before harvest uncertainties. Better protected, certainly. Better fed, but not immune. A failed growing season reaches everyone eventually. Near the hearth, an elderly servant stirs a steaming cauldron while muttering softly over handfuls of herbs tied in cloth. Some swear rosemary protects against spoiled grain. Others hang garlic beside granaries to keep away both rats and evil spirits. The rats, unfortunately, appear unconcerned by spiritual symbolism. A loud argument suddenly erupts farther down the table between 2 retainers, debating whether beans weaken courage before battle. One insists soldiers should eat beef whenever possible. The other points out most soldiers cannot afford such opinions. The debate grows surprisingly philosophical for men holding greasy trenchers. Meanwhile, beneath the tables, the dogs conduct important diplomatic negotiations involving dropped scraps and strategic growling. You continue eating while the hall settles gradually into the soft rhythm of medieval evening life. Candles hiss gently, ale sloshes into cups, wet cloaks steam beside the fire. Outside, wind rattles faintly against shutters, while somewhere distant the monastery bells roll once again across the valley. Always the bells, always the fields. The Lord eventually rises and gestures toward the windows overlooking the darkening farmland beyond town walls. "My grandfather fought 3 border wars," he says quietly. "My father expanded these walls." He pauses, but neither mattered half so much as the year the southern fields finally produced enough grain to feed winter without imports. The hall grows quieter around him. Even now, it is hard to tell whether men like him fully understand the truth they speak aloud. Castles look powerful, knights look powerful, but underneath every stone wall rests farming. No harvests, no rents, no soldiers, no manor hall glowing warm against winter darkness. Just cold land and hungry people. The Lord sits again heavily while servants clear empty trenchers. One candle near the high table gutters low, spilling wax across tarnished brass before a servant hurriedly trims the wick. Outside, dusk deepens fully into night. Torches flicker along the courtyard walls while stable boys carry fresh hay through drifting mist. Beyond the manor lands, hidden beneath frost and darkness, lie the open fields you crossed yesterday morning, quiet now, sleeping beneath winter stars. Yet already every person in this hall thinks toward them, toward spring planting, toward seed grain, toward weather, toward survival. A musician near the hearth plucks softly at a lute, while conversation lowers into murmurs. The dog beside your bench snores faintly, entirely at peace with the world so long as scraps continue falling at regular intervals. And gradually, amid smoke-black beams and flickering candlelight, you begin to understand how farming changed not only hunger, but power itself. Because once the earth could feed many people from one place, everything else gathered around it. Walls, lords, taxes, markets, monasteries. Even this warm hall glowing against the cold night beyond its shutters. All born quietly from furrows in muddy ground, the manor hall quiets slowly after supper, though medieval quiet never truly means silence. Somewhere in the rafters, wind hums softly through gaps in the timber. Dogs shuffle beneath benches searching for forgotten scraps with the dedication of seasoned treasure hunters. A servant coughs near the kitchens. Another carries dripping buckets across the rush-covered floor while muttering about lazy stable boys and cracked barrels. Life continues even after candles burn low, especially in winter. You linger near the hearth while the last of the ale disappears from heavy cups around the hall. Brother Aldrich has long since returned to the monastery, leaving you among the manor servants who move with tired familiarity through the smoky warmth. The steward from earlier approaches carrying an iron ring crowded with keys. Real keys. Heavy black iron things large enough to lock dragons inside cupboards. "You've seen the fields," he says quietly. "You may as well see where the fields end up." The dog rises immediately to follow, which suggests either loyalty or a strong interest in unattended food storage. Possibly both. You follow the steward through narrow stone corridors lit by dim tallow lamps that smell faintly like burnt sheep. The deeper you walk into the manor, the colder the air becomes. Warmth from the hall fades behind thick walls while your footsteps echo softly across worn stone. At the end of one passage, the steward unlocks a reinforced oak door banded with iron. The hinges groan open reluctantly. Cold air rolls outward, smelling of grain, dust, dry wood, and faintly of mice. The winter storehouse. Inside, lantern light reveals towering stacks of sacks and barrels arranged with almost military precision. Barley, oats, rye, dried peas, smoked fish packed in salt, apples stored carefully beneath straw, bundles of onions hanging from beams overhead. The entire room feels less like a cellar and more like bottled survival. These stores feed the household until spring, the steward explains while lifting his lantern higher, and sometimes half the village besides. His voice carries softly between the stacked grain sacks. You walk slowly through narrow aisles between the stores. Every barrel bears markings burned into the wood showing contents and harvest dates. Some older sacks rest apart from newer grain because dampness ruined part of the crop. Others are sprinkled with crushed herbs to discourage pests. Mint, wormwood, lavender. Some swear lavender keeps rats away. The rats appear politely unconvinced. Near the back wall stands a raised wooden platform holding the best seed grain reserved for spring planting. These sacks sit apart beneath waxed cloth and careful watch. No one touches them unnecessarily, even during hunger. Especially during hunger, because eating seed grain means stealing directly from the future. The steward notices you studying the raised platform. My father saw villages consume their planting grain one winter, he says quietly. Said the following year looked like the world itself had forgotten how to continue. The lantern crackles softly between you. Outside, wind brushes faintly against the walls above ground, while somewhere distant a bell rings across the sleeping valley. You move deeper into the storehouse where smoked meats hang dark beneath ceiling beams. Wheels of hard cheese rest wrapped in cloth beside casks of weak ale brewed thick enough to survive winter storage. One corner contains baskets of shriveled pears carefully sorted from the healthier fruit before rot spreads. Everything here demands constant watching, constant sorting, constant caution, because medieval storage sits in permanent battle against mold, damp, insects, thieves, weather, and time itself. You notice several tiny charms tied above one grain rack, twisted straw circles threaded with bits of dried rosemary and red wool. The steward catches your glance and shrugs. Housekeeper insists they keep spoilage away. Do they? She's used them 20 years. We still have grain. Fair argument. A scratching sound suddenly echoes from somewhere near the back wall. The dog stiffens instantly before charging forward with surprising enthusiasm. Several moments of chaos follow involving barrels, offended squeaking, and one servant loudly cursing from behind a stack of oats. Eventually, the dog emerges triumphantly carrying absolutely nothing. Still, its confidence remains admirable. The steward leads you down a short stair into a lower chamber colder than the rest. Here the air smells damp and earthy. Root vegetables fill wooden bins beneath hanging lanterns, turnips, carrots, parsnips, cabbages wrapped tightly against decay. Winter food. Heavy food. Food designed less for joy than survival. No one can quite agree who first learned proper winter storage, the steward says while checking a cabbage thoughtfully. Some claim monks taught it, others say peasants always knew. He pauses. Most likely hungry people simply kept experimenting until fewer relatives died. That seems to describe a surprising amount of human progress. Further along the chamber, you find a small locked alcove holding wax candles, sacks of salt, and bundles of dried herbs tied carefully from ceiling hooks. Remedies for illness, preservatives for meat, protection against bad air, according to some. Even now, it is hard to tell where medicine ends and superstition begins in this world. Perhaps the people here do not care much about the difference if something works often enough. The steward unlocks another smaller door revealing the manor's emergency reserve. This grain is untouched, perfectly dry, perfectly guarded, reserved for catastrophe alone. Famine grain. You stare at the stacked sacks in silence while the steward lowers his lantern. There are winters, he says softly, when villagers walk here like ghosts asking whether anything remains. The room suddenly feels very still. You imagine snowbound roads, empty cupboards, mothers thinning pottage with water, oxen slaughtered too early, frost-killing spring shoots before they rise. And behind every fear rests one simple truth: farming makes survival possible, but never guaranteed. That is what changes humanity so deeply. Not abundance exactly. Uncertainty managed slightly better than before. Outside the cellar, the manor above creaks gently in the night wind. Somewhere far overhead comes muffled laughter from servants finishing their work near the kitchens. Life continues warmly above ground because these stores exist below. The steward finally locks the emergency reserve again with careful hands. You see now, he murmurs while guiding you back upstairs, why fields matter more than banners. You do. The great hall feels almost startlingly warm after the cold store chambers. Most candles have burned low now. Only a few servants remain awake, spreading fresh rushes across the floor and banking the hearth for night. Smoke drifts lazily upward into the rafters, while outside the shutters, darkness presses against the windows. One young kitchen girl carries stale crust toward a basket near the door. For tomorrow's pottage, she explains matter-of-factly. Nothing wasted. Ever. You settle once more near the dying fire while the dog collapses beside you after its exhausting war against invisible cellar rats. Beyond the manor walls, the valley sleeps beneath frost and drifting mist. Somewhere in distant cottages, peasants count remaining onions and worry over spring rain. Somewhere monks guard seed jars beside candlelight. Somewhere merchants sleep atop grain wagons in locked courtyards. And beneath every roof, from monastery to manor to muddy village hut, winter survival depends upon what the fields produced before the cold arrived. The fire cracks softly. A bell tolls midnight far across the dark land, and hidden below your feet in locked stone chambers, next year's life waits patiently inside sacks of grain. Morning comes wrapped in fog so thick the manor courtyard appears to float inside a cloud. Frost whitens the stable roofs. Horses stamp impatiently beside troughs crusted with thin ice, while servants hurry through the pale gloom carrying baskets, buckets, and armfuls of firewood against their chests. The dog greets the dawn by stealing half a sausage from an inattentive kitchen boy, and then looking deeply philosophical about the entire incident. You leave the manor shortly after sunrise with a small group of travellers bound for the pilgrim road running south through the valley. Brother Aldrich walks beside you once again, his satchel bumping against his hip while two older pilgrims follow behind wrapped in patched wool cloaks decorated with tiny pewter badges shaped like saints. One pilgrim badge shows a fish. Another appears to show a foot. You decide not to ask. The road beyond town twists through bare winter orchards and muddy pasture land where crows peck between frost-hardened grasses. Thin mist drifts low across the fields, while the pale sun hangs overhead like dull silver behind clouds. Travel in medieval winter mostly involves damp feet and cautious optimism. Wagon ruts filled with icy water force you repeatedly toward the road edges, where thorn bushes claw at cloaks and boots sink unpleasantly into mud. Every so often you pass roadside shrines tucked beneath old trees or perched atop mossy stones. Tiny offerings rest their candles, wilted herbs, scraps of cloth, even crusts of bread left for wandering spirits or hungry saints depending on who explains it. No one can quite agree whether saints appreciate stale bread. The older pilgrims certainly seem convinced. By midday the fog begins lifting slowly, revealing wider stretches of farmland rolling across the valley beneath winter skies. Here and there smoke rises from isolated cottages surrounded by fenced gardens and haystacks protected beneath thatch coverings. Fields spread outward everywhere, some freshly ploughed dark against the frost, some lying fallow beneath tangled weeds, some dotted with sheep grazing close to the ground. Even the roads themselves exist because farming made regular travel worthwhile. Harvests create markets, markets create roads, roads create pilgrims, merchants, messengers, and wandering strangers with muddy boots. Like you. Brother Aldrich walks quietly for a time before pointing toward a distant line of wagons moving slowly along another ridge. Salt traders, he says. They follow grain routes whenever possible. Because where grain gathers, people gather. And where people gather, someone eventually decides to sell them things. The dog trots ahead, sniffing puddles with grave concentration, while the older pilgrims mutter prayers beneath their breath every time ravens cross overhead. One of them finally explains that ravens flying eastward before noon supposedly warn of storms. The other pilgrim disagrees immediately and claims ravens only predict death when flying in pairs. The birds might meanwhile continue behaving entirely like birds. You stop briefly near a roadside fire where several merchants warm their hands beside wagons loaded with sacks of oats covered beneath waxed canvas. The smell of smoke and boiling onions drifts through the cold air while horses chew patiently at nosebags filled with feed grain. Everything eats grain eventually. People directly, animals indirectly. Even travel depends upon fields far away. One merchant offers you a wooden cup of hot ale flavoured with herbs sharp enough to clear every memory from your head. He claims the mixture prevents winter sickness. Brother Aldrich whispers afterward that the merchant says this every year and still coughs constantly from November onward. The road continues southward through shallow woods where bare branches creak overhead in the wind. Moss clings thickly to tree trunks while muddy leaves rot beneath your boots. Tiny shrines appear occasionally nailed to trees painted saints, carved symbols, bundles of dried flowers tied with ribbon. Some swear forest spirits dislike iron bells. Others insist spirits fear church songs. Medieval people prepare for uncertainty by believing slightly in everything. By late afternoon the trees thin again, revealing another cluster of fields stretching toward a distant village. Here the land looks richer somehow. Wider furrows, larger barns, better drainage channels cut carefully beside the roads. Farming changes landscapes quietly over generations until entire valleys begin looking shaped rather than wild. Ahead, the pilgrim road widens beside a small stone bridge crossing a narrow river, dark with winter runoff. A shrine stands beside the crossing, protected beneath a wooden awning blackened by age and smoke. Beeswax candles flicker before a weathered saint holding what appears to be either a loaf of bread or a very unfortunate stone. The carving quality leaves room for interpretation. Several travellers stop automatically to murmur prayers before crossing. One merchant touches the bridge stones 3 times for luck because his grandmother swore bridges attract hungry spirits during winter floods. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether the spirits drown travellers or merely steal boots. You cross carefully anyway. The river below moves cold and black beneath drifting mist. Along the banks stand several water meadows fenced for grazing once spring arrives. Beyond them, More fields climb gently toward the horizon. Always fields, always the quiet geometry of farming spreading across the world. As evening approaches, the travellers finally reach a roadside shelter maintained by a nearby abbey. The structure is simple stone walls, timber roof, smoky hearth, and enough floor space for exhausted humans willing to overlook nearly everything else. Which medieval travellers absolutely are. Inside, warmth gathers thick beneath soot-black rafters, while strangers crowd shoulder to shoulder around the central fire. Pilgrims dry damp cloaks beside merchants guarding wagons of grain and smoked fish. A shepherd snores already against the far wall with a lamb curled beside him beneath a blanket. The lamb smells marginally better than most travellers. Someone passes around coarse bread still warm from a nearby village oven. Dense rye loaves, heavy enough to require commitment, yet after a day on muddy roads, the smell alone feels comforting beyond reason. You eat beside the hearth while conversation drifts softly through the shelter. A merchant complains about rising tolls near the northern crossings. A pilgrim describes miracles at a distant shrine involving cured fevers and suspiciously profitable candle sales. Another traveller insists this year's winter wheat looks stronger than last season's. Every discussion eventually circles back toward harvests. Because farming no longer merely feeds people now, it binds distant places together. Villages depend on monasteries. Monasteries trade with towns. Towns feed travellers. Travellers carry news, relics, coins, stories, and seeds from one valley into another, all moving slowly along muddy roads carved first by wagons carrying grain. Brother Aldrich sits quietly beside the fire, turning a crust of bread in his hands. Funny thing, he says at last, people imagine farming keeps people rooted. He gestures toward the crowded shelter. But once harvests become reliable enough, people finally have reason to travel farther than hunger. Outside, a wind brushes softly against the walls while darkness settles fully across the valley. Somewhere distant, hidden beyond fields and rivers and winter orchards, monastery bells ring faintly through the cold evening air. The dog curls beside your boots near the warmth of the fire. Around you, travellers eat bread baked from grain grown miles away by hands they will never know. And beneath the dark fields outside, next year's harvest already waits silently beneath frost and soil, tying the world together one muddy road at a time. Rain begins sometime before dawn. Not dramatic rain with thunder and flashing skies. Medieval weather rarely bothers with theatrics when quiet misery works perfectly well. This rain settles in patiently, tapping against the roadside shelter roof hour after hour until the whole world smells of wet wood, soaked wool, and rising mud. You wake to the sound of travellers groaning softly as they realise the road outside has transformed into soup. The shepherd's lamb remains inexplicably cheerful about it. Inside the shelter, dim grey light filters through narrow shutters while smoke curls lazily beneath the rafters. Someone stirs the hearth back to life using damp firewood that protests loudly with hissing steam. Pilgrims wrap themselves in cloaks still cold from yesterday's rain. Merchants mutter prayers regarding wagon wheels and road conditions. Both concerns appear equally spiritual this morning. Brother Aldrich sits cross-legged near the fire, chewing coarse bread with the distant expression of a man already anticipating blisters. You can always tell winter roads by the smell, he says. You inhale cautiously. Mud. Wet leather. Smoke. Horse. Despair. Accurate enough. By mid-morning the travellers continue onward despite the weather because medieval journeys obey necessity rather than comfort. The road stretches across open farmland where rainwater gathers in flooded ruts, deep enough to threaten small livestock. Every step pulls at your boots. Cloaks cling damply to shoulders. Wind presses cold mist against your face. And still, scattered across the valley, farmers work. You see them through the rain, moving slowly along the open fields, figures wrapped in wool and straw capes repairing drainage ditches, checking boundary markers, covering haystacks against the weather. Farming does not pause for unpleasant conditions because unpleasant conditions are usually the main thing farming deals with. The pilgrim road eventually climbs a shallow ridge overlooking a vast patchwork of common fields spreading toward the horizon. Long strips divide the land into narrow holdings farmed by different families, some planted, some resting, some churned into dark mud beneath the endless drizzle. No fences separate most of them, only memory, custom, agreement, and the occasional furious argument. Brother Aldrich points toward the valley below. Each family works scattered strips, he explains. Good land divided among many households so no one holds only poor soil. You stare across the fields trying to imagine keeping track of it all. One strip here, another half a mile away, another beside the marsh edge. Medieval farming often feels less like organisation and more like collective optimism held together by habit. The rain intensifies briefly, driving everyone toward a cluster of willow trees beside the road where several villagers already shelter beneath rough canvas stretched between poles. A small fire sputters stubbornly in the damp air while steam rises from cloaks gathered around it. You join them gratefully. An elderly farmer with hands like twisted roots pokes the fire thoughtfully using a stick blackened from years of similar mornings. Too much rain rots wheat, he mutters. A younger woman beside him disagrees immediately. Too little rain kills barley. They continue debating weather patterns with the seriousness of military strategists planning campaigns. Perhaps they are. The old farmer eventually notices your curiosity and gestures toward the valley fields below. Those strips belong to 23 families, he says. Some shared since grandfather's time, some older. He points toward a muddy lane cutting through the open ground. Village cattle graze there after harvest, manor sheep in spring. No pigs after St. Clement's Day because someone always loses turnips. The younger woman snorts softly. It was one turnip. It was an important turnip. No one can quite agree whether medieval villages survived through cooperation or through endless arguments managed carefully enough to avoid actual murder. Probably a mixture. Rain drips steadily from the canvas overhead, while the fire struggles bravely against damp wood. Nearby, several children chase each other through puddles wearing expressions of alarming joy. One carries a carved wooden whistle, supposedly used to scare crows from planted fields. The whistle mostly seems to attract louder children. An old woman seated near the fire unwraps bundles of dried herbs tied with faded ribbon. For the damp, she explains while tossing rosemary and thyme into the flames. The smoke changes immediately, sharp and earthy beneath the smell of wet wool. Some swear certain herbs keep sickness from spreading through crowded villages during rainy winters. Others burn them simply because medieval life smells terrible often enough to justify experimentation. The rain eases slightly by midday, leaving the valley wrapped in drifting mist. Across the fields you notice small stone markers standing beside some furrows. Boundary stones. Important things. Very important things. Brother Aldrich lowers his voice slightly. Move one during the night, he says, and entire villages may feud for generations. Farming creates ownership. Ownership creates boundaries. Boundaries create disputes conducted with astonishing emotional intensity over surprisingly specific patches of mud. You continue along the road while the villagers return reluctantly to their work. One group repairs drainage channels beside flooded strips using wooden shovels and baskets of stones. Another spreads manure across fallow ground despite the rain. A glamorous profession, farming remains not. Still, Beneath the dreary weather, the fields carry a strange dignity. These open strips feed villages, fund monasteries, support markets, and fill manor storehouses. Quiet labour stretched across muddy land. And everyone depends upon it. By afternoon you reach a small village gathered around a squat stone church whose bell tower rises above the rain-dark roofs. Water drips steadily from the eaves, while smoke hangs low across the lanes. The manor court meets today inside the church porch because the weather has driven everyone under cover. You pause near the doorway listening as villagers argue before a bored-looking reeve seated behind a narrow table. A dispute over grazing rights. Another over damaged fencing. Another involving ducks wandering into bean strips under suspicious circumstances. The reeve records each complaint carefully onto parchment while trying not to look emotionally defeated. Even now, it is hard to tell whether medieval law exists mainly to protect order or to document increasingly specific grudges. A farmer nearby mutters that last year someone stole cabbages during Lent and blamed wandering spirits. Were there spirits, you ask? He shrugs. Cabbages still vanished. Fair enough. The rain finally begins fading toward evening, though the roads remain hopelessly deep with mud. You shelter briefly beneath the church porch while bells ring across the soaked valley. Farmers continue moving through the fields despite the cold, tiny figures dark against silver rainwater and winter earth. Always working, always preparing, always thinking ahead toward planting, grazing, harvest, storage. The rhythm never fully stops. Brother Aldrich watches the distant fields quietly. People imagine farming made life easier, he says softly. But mostly it made life shared. You understand what he means now. Shared fields, shared roads, shared risks, shared winters. Farming ties people together whether they like one another or not. Villages grow from that closeness. Laws grow from villages. Customs grow from laws. Civilization itself begins forming slowly out of muddy cooperation and stubborn survival. The church bell rings again through the damp evening air. Smoke rises from cottage chimneys across the valley while rainwater glimmers in the furrows below. And beneath the darkening sky, the common fields stretch outward endlessly, carrying the quiet weight of countless human lives side by side. The rain leaves during the night, though it departs reluctantly, dragging mist behind it like an old cloak across the valley. Morning rises pale and cold over the village where puddles shine silver between cottages and smoke drifts low from damp chimneys. You wake inside the church shelter to the sound of grinding stone. Slow, heavy, endless. At first you think thunder still rolls somewhere distant beneath the hills. Then the rhythm steadies into something more deliberate. Brother Aldrich smiles faintly beside the dying fire. The mill, he says. Of course. Because even after grain grows, dries, travels, stores, trades, and survives winter, another transformation still waits beside the river. Bread begins with fields, but flour begins at the mill. You leave the village shortly after dawn, following a muddy track sloping toward the river valley. Frost clings to reeds along the ditch banks while thin ice cracks beneath your boots in shaded places untouched by sunlight. The dog races ahead through wet grass with terrifying confidence, considering the number of puddles large enough to hide sheep. The grinding sound grows louder gradually. Ahead, beside the dark river, the mill appears through drifting mist. A broad timber building crouched against the water with a great wheel turning steadily beneath the current. Water rushes through the channel in white froth, while the wheel groans and creaks like some enormous wooden beast waking unwillingly for work. Which, in a sense, it is. Several wagons already wait outside loaded with grain sacks protected beneath tarred cloth. Farmers stand nearby, stamping warmth into numb feet, while chickens wander between the wheels looking busy and underqualified. The air smells wonderful. Wet wood, river water, fresh flour, smoke, and warm bread baking somewhere nearby. A miller emerges from the doorway coated almost entirely in pale flour dust. His beard, eyebrows, sleeves, and boots all carry a fine white layer, making him resemble a snowstorm shaped vaguely like a man. "No dogs near the grain," he shouts immediately. The dog, naturally, ignores him. Inside, the mill roars with motion and sound. Massive wooden gears turn overhead while millstones grind together in slow, relentless circles. Grain pours from hoppers in golden streams before disappearing between the stones with a sound like distant rain. Dust hangs in the warm air, glowing pale in shafts of winter sunlight. Workers move constantly through the noise, carrying sacks, adjusting chutes, checking flour bins. Everything vibrates slightly beneath your feet from the turning machinery. And suddenly farming feels different here. Larger somehow. Not merely fields and weather anymore, but systems, processes, human effort harnessed together. The miller guides you carefully around spinning shafts and grinding stones while shouting over the noise. "River's strong this winter," he says proudly. "Wheel hasn't frozen once." He pats one of the wooden beams affectionately. No one can quite agree whether mills are miracles or cursed contraptions. A worker nearby mutters something about broken fingers and swallowed sleeves. Reasonable concerns. You watch grain become flour almost hypnotically. Sack after sack emptied into hoppers, stone grinding endlessly, white meal spilling into waiting bins below. Transformation through repetition. The same rhythm farming always seems to follow. Near one wall stands a small shrine holding a candle blackened with flour dust. A painted saint watches over the room with an expression suggesting deep concern regarding machinery. The miller notices your glance. Some swear mills attract spirits, he explains. Too much turning, too much noise. Do you believe that? He shrugs. I believe loose gears kill faster than spirits. Again, difficult to argue with medieval practicality when it appears. Outside beside the riverbank, women knead dough beneath an awning while children carry baskets of fresh flour toward village ovens uphill. The smell drifting from those ovens reaches even the mill yard. Warm rye bread, barley loaves, oat cakes crackling at the edges. The scent alone nearly convinces you civilization was worth inventing. A line of farmers waits patiently near the weighing tables where the miller's assistants collect milling tolls. Every sack ground here leaves behind a portion owed to the lord or monastery controlling the mill rights. Because of course it does. Even rivers apparently pay taxes in medieval society. One farmer complains loudly that last month's flour measured lighter than expected. The assistant responds with equally loud confidence that moisture ruined the grain weight before grinding. They continue arguing with such intensity you suspect this discussion may survive several generations. Brother Aldrich leans closer. Mill disputes sometimes outlive marriages. The grinding never stops. Hour after hour the wheel turns beside the river while sacks arrive from surrounding fields and villages, grain from dozens of farms mixing into common flour, harvest transformed into daily bread for people scattered across the valley. You begin noticing how many lives gather around this single place. Bakers, farmers, carters, labourers, children carrying flour baskets, women trading loaves, monks recording tolls, even travellers stopping simply for warmth and news. Farming builds communities not only through fields but through shared necessities afterward. The mill binds them together. Near midday, the miller invites you upstairs to a loft overlooking the river. From there you can see the valley stretching outward beneath pale winter skies. Fields spread beyond the village, smoke rises from distant cottages, roads wind through muddy pastureland toward unseen towns farther south, and always wagons moving. Grain moving, bread moving, people moving because harvests make movement possible. The miller tears apart a loaf still warm from the ovens below and hands you half. Dense dark rye with cracked crust and steam curling softly into the cold loft air. Perfect. You eat while watching the wheel turn endlessly beneath you. My grandfather said villages without mills stay hungry longer, the miller says quietly. Too much labour wasted grinding by hand. He gestures toward the great wheel below. But water never tires. Perhaps that is another quiet turning point hidden inside farming itself. Once humans settle beside fields, they begin harnessing rivers, animals, seasons, and tools in ways wandering people rarely could. Fields lead to mills. Mills lead to towns. Towns lead to everything else. Outside. Afternoon sunlight finally breaks through the clouds fully for the first time in days. The river flashes silver beneath the spinning wheel, while flour dust drifts lazily through golden light inside the mill. Even now, it is hard to tell whether the place feels more like a workshop or a living creature. Grinding, breathing, feeding the valley. As evening approaches, workers begin covering flour bins and sweeping spilled grain carefully from the floor, because waste means hunger somewhere later. Children carry the last warm loaves uphill toward cottages already glowing with firelight. Farmers secure empty wagons for the muddy journey home. And still the wheel turns. Slow, patient, eternal as the river itself. You step outside beside the dark water while the grinding hum continues behind the mill walls. The air smells of fresh bread and wet timber. Somewhere far across the fields, bells begin ringing for evening prayers. The dog sits beside you unusually still for once, watching the water wheel spin through fading light. All day grain has arrived here from scattered fields across the valley. By tomorrow morning, it will become bread resting on countless wooden tables. That is the quiet power farming creates, not simply food, but connection. Field to mill, mill to oven, oven to household. One harvest binding entire communities together through the simplest meal imaginable. The river flows steadily beneath the wheel. The bells continue ringing through the dusk, and flour dust glows pale as winter smoke in the fading evening light. Night settles softly over the river valley, while the last warmth from the bakery ovens drifts through the village lanes. Behind you, the mill wheel continues turning in darkness with slow, watery groans, like some ancient creature refusing sleep. Lanterns flicker beside cottage doors. Smoke curls low beneath the stars. Somewhere nearby, someone sings badly enough to alarm passing birds. The dog seems offended by the performance. You follow Brother Aldrich uphill toward the village alehouse where yellow light spills through warped shutters into the muddy street. A painted sign creaks overhead in the evening wind, showing a faded boar holding what may once have been a tankard. Centuries have not been kind to the boar. Inside, warmth crashes over you immediately. Thick warmth, dense warmth, the sort of warmth flavoured heavily with smoke, spilled ale, damp wool, onion stew, and at least 3 different forms of exhaustion. Perfect medieval comfort. The room hums with low conversation beneath soot-black rafters, crossed by drying herbs and strings of onions. Beeswax candles gutter in iron holders along the walls, while rushes crunch beneath boots sticky from old ale. A fire roars at the hearth large enough to roast half a sheep or several particularly unlucky tax collectors. Farmers crowd the benches tonight beside merchants delayed by muddy roads. Mill workers coated faintly in flour sit near the back wall sharing dark bread and weak ale. A pair of monks argue quietly over whether fasting rules technically apply to eel stew. They seem prepared to debate until spring. You settle beside the hearth while the alewife brings thick pottery cups sloshing with warm barley ale spiced lightly with herbs. It tastes smoky and faintly sour, but wonderfully alive after the cold outdoors. The dog immediately receives scraps from 3 separate tables, confirming once again that medieval survival favours shameless confidence. Near the fire, an old farmer spreads his hands dramatically while describing a failed harvest from years earlier. "Rain for 7 weeks," he says. "Wheat rotted standing upright. Chickens look depressed." A merchant beside him snorts. "Your chickens always look depressed." Fair observation. The conversation rolls onward through the room in slow, overlapping waves. Grain prices, flooded roads, sheep sickness, a missing pig, rumours of wolves farther north. Everywhere you listen, farming sits quietly beneath the discussion like roots beneath floorboards. Because even evenings at the alehouse depend entirely on successful harvests. Enough barley means ale. Enough grain means bread on tables. Enough surplus means people possess time to gather here at all. The alewife moves through the crowded room with astonishing efficiency, while balancing trenchers piled with pottage, onions, and coarse rye loaves. Her husband turns spits near the hearth, where small cuts of mutton roast slowly above dripping fat. Not lavish meals, but warm meals, and warmth matters deeply in winter. Brother Aldrich nods toward the crowded room. "This," he says softly, "does not happen without farming." You look around carefully. He is right. Wandering hunters do not build alehouses beside muddy roads. Travellers do not linger exchanging stories unless someone grows enough food to spare them the time. Communities gather because harvests allow staying. At a nearby table, several mill workers compare hands blistered from lifting grain sacks all day. One insists flour dust keeps away evil spirits because no ghost would willingly remain inside a mill for long. Another claims spirits love mills because they enjoy confusing measurements and souring bread. No one can quite agree whether supernatural beings spend most of their time haunting crossroads, churches, or badly managed bakeries. The mill workers seem deeply committed to finding out. A fiddler begins playing softly near the hearth while conversations drift into easier rhythms. Boots dry beside the fire. Steam rises from cloaks hung along the walls. Someone laughs hard enough to spill ale into the rushes. Nobody appears concerned. The rushes have survived worse. You notice how varied the crowd feels tonight. Farmers from nearby strips, merchants carrying salt and wool, pilgrims bound farther south, monks from the abbey, a cooper repairing grain barrels, even a travelling tinker asleep beside the wall with copper pots stacked beside him like metallic children. All gathered because farming created enough stability for specialised lives. Once not everyone must hunt constantly for survival, strange professions begin appearing. Millers, smiths, brewers, scribes, aloeves, men whose entire occupation somehow involves carving decorative spoons. Humanity becomes wonderfully specific once food grows predictable. The alewife eventually places before you a thick trencher of barley stew swimming with onions and tiny pieces of smoked meat. Beside it rests a dark loaf fresh enough to steam when torn apart. Simple food? Heavy food. Food built from fields. You eat slowly while the storm lanterns sway faintly overhead. Outside, wind brushes against the shutters while distant bells drift from the monastery through the night air. Always the bells. Always reminding the valley that time passes whether crops grow or fail. At the far end of the room, a merchant unrolls a rough map stained with ale rings and candle soot. He traces grain routes connecting towns, rivers, mills, and ports farther away than most villagers will ever travel. Bad harvest in one valley, he says, and prices rise 3 towns over. The farmers listen carefully. That is another quiet change farming creates over centuries. Distant places begin depending on one another. Roads matter more. Rivers matter more. News travels faster because harvest elsewhere affects survival here. A village no longer stands entirely alone. The fiddler changes tunes while several children doze against their mother's shoulders near the fire. Smoke drifts lazily upward into the rafters where soot hangs thick as velvet. Somewhere outside, a horse stamps impatiently in the muddy lane. Brother Aldrich tears apart another crust of bread thoughtfully. My grandfather wandered forests hunting deer, he says, or so he claimed after enough ale. Did he? Probably not. He complained constantly about sleeping outdoors. Reasonable man. The monk glances around the crowded alehouse. But this life villages, markets, roads, monasteries, mills, it all grows from fields people trusted enough to stay beside. Stay. That may be the most important word of all. Farming teaches humanity to remain in one place long enough for roots deeper than survival itself to form. Families, trades, customs, friendships, grudges lasting 4 generations over stolen geese. Civilization turns out to be partly organized memory tied to land. The fire burns lower as the night deepens. One by one, travellers drift towards sleeping benches or rented lofts above the alehouse. Farmers pull cloaks tight before stepping back into the cold darkness toward distant cottages. Tomorrow begins early. Fields never rest long. The alewife banks the hearth while muttering about bread deliveries before dawn. Even now, preparations for the next day continue beneath the sleepy warmth of the room. Because farming is not only harvest, it is repetition. Continuous, patient repetition shaping entire lives around seasons and stored grain. You finish the last of the barley stew while outside the village settles beneath winter stars. Somewhere down by the river, the mill wheel still turns steadily through darkness. And all across the valley, beneath cottage roofs and monastery stone and manor walls, people sleep with bread in their bellies because countless hands worked muddy fields months before. The candles flicker lower. The fiddler falls silent, and the alehouse glows softly against the cold medieval night, built quietly from grain, labour, and time. Before dawn, frost returns. It creeps over the village roofs in the dark hours after the alehouse fire burns low, silvering thatch, barrels, fences, wagon wheels, and every forgotten bucket left outdoors by someone who will regret it shortly. When you step outside, the cold meets your face with the delicate tenderness of a wet slap. The village lies almost still. Almost. A few chimneys already breathe smoke into the black-blue morning. Somewhere a horse shifts in its stall. The mill wheel turns faintly down by the river, slower now beneath cold water. Above the church roof, stars fade one by one as pale light gathers behind the eastern hills. Brother Aldrich waits near the lane wrapped in his damp cloak, holding a lantern. The dog sits beside him, looking proud, alert, and entirely uninvited. Early fields today, the monk says softly. Of course. Farming, you have learned, possesses a personal grudge against sleep. You follow the path out beyond the cottages, past fences rimed with frost and haystacks covered beneath careful thatch. The ground crunches underfoot where yesterday's mud has hardened overnight. Each breath hangs white in front of you. Your fingers ache inside your sleeves. Ahead, villagers move like shadows across the pale fields. They come carrying baskets, wooden tools, seed sacks, and bundles of old straw. Some walk silently. Others murmur prayers beneath their breath. A boy drags a rake twice his size with heroic suffering. His father tells him to stop looking like a martyr unless he plans to become a saint before breakfast. The boy appears to consider this option. You reach the new furrows just as dawn spills thin grey light across the valley. Frost gleams along every ridge of turned earth. It makes the fields beautiful in a hard, quiet way, as if the land has been dusted with crushed glass. But beauty is not comfort. A woman kneels beside one furrow, pressing her palm into the frozen soil. "Too cold," she mutters. An old man beside her shakes his head. Cold top only, soil beneath still kind. No one can quite agree whether soil can be kind, cruel, sleepy, hungry, or offended. Yet everyone speaks of it as if it listens. Perhaps after enough years bending over earth, it begins to feel rude not to. Villagers spread slowly across the open strips. Some carry seed grain reserved from last harvest, guarded all winter as carefully as silver. Others bring ash, manure, or crushed shells to scatter over the ground. A few tie charms to stakes at the corners of their strips, red wool threads, carved crosses, dried rowan twigs, feathers from black hens. Some swear rowan protects young crops from blight. Others claim a black hen's feather keeps envious neighbours from souring the field with bad wishes. Even now, it is hard to tell whether anyone believes these charms completely. But nobody laughs. A failed crop can make even the cleverest person respectful toward mysteries. Brother Aldrich helps an elderly widow carry a small sack toward her narrow strip near the marshy edge of the field. Her hands shake slightly as she opens it. Inside rests seed barley saved from the previous harvest, each grain small and pale in the dawn light. "This was my husband's best field," she says. She does not say more. She does not need to. Farming keeps memory in strange places, in tools worn smooth by dead hands, in boundary stones set by grandfathers, in seed saved from seasons when someone still stood beside you. The widow scatters the first handful carefully along the furrow. Not enough to feed anyone now. Enough, with luck, to feed many later. That is the bargain farming always asks people to make. Give up food today. Bury it in darkness. Trust rain, sun, soil, beasts, neighbours, saints, and chance to return it multiplied. A bold arrangement, really. Humanity built civilization partly by agreeing to hide dinner underground and hope for the best. The frost begins softening as the sun rises, leaving the fields damp and dark beneath your boots. You walk slowly between strips while villagers work in steady rhythm. Seed falls from open hands. Rakes pull soil gently over it. Children chase crows from the edges before the birds can steal too much. The crows wait patiently nearby like creditors. One child swings a wooden clapper above his head, shouting at them with the full authority of someone wearing mismatched boots. The crows hop backward a few steps, deeply unimpressed. Near the hedge, an old woman heats a small iron pot over a twig fire. Steam rises from a mixture of garlic, ale, and herbs. She dips bits of cloth into it, then hands them to farmers to tie round wrists or plough handles. "For chill in the bones," she says. Brother Aldrich whispers that last winter she gave the same remedy to a coughing goat and declared it improved. Did it? The goat stopped complaining. A meaningful result, perhaps. By mid-morning the sky clears into a hard pale blue. Sunlight touches the valley, but warmth remains mostly theoretical. Farmers pause beside the field edge to eat bread, cheese, and onions wrapped in cloth. Someone passes around weak ale from a leather bottle stiff with cold. You sit on a fallen log with Brother Aldrich while the dog receives crusts from nearly everyone. Its social strategy continues to outperform most human institutions. From here, the fields stretch wide and quiet beneath the winter sun. Newly seeded furrows lie dark against frost-white grasses. Beyond them rise the village roofs, the church tower, the distant manor, the road toward the mill, and farther still, the Abbey bell tower hazy against the hills. All connected, all waiting. A young farmer nearby stares across the furrows with worry carved into his face. "Last year worms took half the peas," he says. Another replies, "Year before, late frost took the beans." A third adds, "Year before that, the reeve took everything else." This earns a few tired smiles. Medieval humour often survives by standing very close to complaint. The truth remains beneath the joke. Farming gives stability, but never certainty. Every planted field is hope exposed to weather. Every stored sack is time borrowed against hunger. Every village depends upon patterns that can break. And still they plant, again and again, because not planting is worse. After the meal, work resumes. The villagers repair hedge gaps with woven branches to keep livestock from trampling young shoots later in spring. They clear stones from the strips, deepen little drainage channels, and mark boundaries with stakes where rain has shifted the soil. You help carry stones into a pile beside the lane until your arms ache and your palms roughen against cold rock. It is ordinary labour, unimpressive labour, the sort nobody sings about unless they are very bored or being paid poorly in ale. Yet civilization rests on exactly this. Not on single heroic gestures, but on millions of small tasks repeated by people who need the future to arrive with bread in it. By late afternoon, thin clouds gather again above the hills. A chill wind crosses the open land, bending dead grasses along the ditch banks. The villagers begin packing tools while checking the seeded strips one last time. The widow pauses by her field and presses 2 fingers to her lips, then touches the soil. Some swear this wakes the seed. Others say it is only farewell to the dead. Those who tell the tale never fully agree. The bell rings from the church as evening settles, answered faintly by the abbey beyond the valley. Smoke rises from cottages. Oxen low softly near the byres. Children trail home exhausted and muddy, still waving clappers at crows who have already resumed their patient watch. You walk back beside Brother Aldrich through the frost-edged lane. Behind you, the new furrows darken under the coming night. Nothing has changed visibly. No green shoots. No harvest. No promise anyone can hold. Only seeds hidden beneath cold earth. And yet everyone's life has tilted toward them. The village will sleep tonight thinking of weather, the manor will count reserves, the abbey will pray over fields, the mill will wait for grain not yet grown. The whole valley holds its breath beneath winter stars. Because farming is hope made practical, buried carefully in mud, and guarded by tired hands until spring decides what kind of mercy it will offer. The frost melts slowly over the next morning, dripping from thatched roofs and bare branches in steady silver taps. Water runs along the village lanes in thin streams carrying straw, ash, and yesterday's footprints toward the river below. Smoke rises straight upward into the still air, which the older villagers immediately declare suspicious. Quiet air means weather thinking, one farmer mutters darkly while repairing a fence. No one asks what the weather is thinking. Probably because the answer would be unpleasant. Brother Aldrich meets you outside the church carrying 2 wicker baskets filled with tools, bundles of herbs, and several beeswax candles tucked carefully between folded cloths. The abbey gardens need tending, he says. The dog appears beside him at once, clearly believing all journeys now require its supervision. You follow the narrow path climbing away from the village toward the monastery hills. The ground softens beneath your boots as sunlight warms the earth. Small birds flicker through hedges. Somewhere beyond the trees, bells drift across the valley in slow, familiar waves. Always the bells. Ahead, the monastery rises from the hillside once more, its stone walls glowing pale beneath the winter sun. Smoke curls from the kitchens. A mule cart rattles through the gate carrying empty grain sacks toward the lower fields. Near the orchard walls, several monks prune bare apple trees while arguing quietly about whether last year's pears spoiled because of weather or because Brother Mathieu ignored instructions again. Brother Mathieu appears unconvinced by both accusations. You enter through the side gate leading toward the Abbey Gardens, and suddenly the world changes. Not warmer exactly, but softer. Stone walls shelter the gardens from harsh winds, creating pockets of damp green life even in winter's grip. Narrow paths wind between raised beds edged with woven willow branches. Herbs grow beneath frost-dark soil and protective covering sage, rosemary, thyme, fennel, mint, rue, lavender. The air smells alive here. Earthy, sharp, green beneath the cold. Monks move quietly through the garden carrying baskets of compost, trimming dead stems, checking roots protected beneath straw. Beeswax candles flicker inside tiny glass lanterns hung beside certain beds where delicate plants sleep through winter. Brother Aldrich kneels beside a patch of winter cabbage and brushes frost from the leaves gently with his sleeve. People think monasteries survive on prayer, he says. Really, we survive on gardens. Fair. The Abbey Gardens stretch farther than you first realise. Beyond the herbs lie orchard rows, bean plots, onion beds, and enclosed bee skeps protected beneath straw covers. Tiny channels carry water carefully between the beds, while old stone markers label certain plants in faded Latin. You pass one elderly monk crouched beside a patch of garlic muttering to himself. Brother Odo speaks to plants, Aldrich whispers. Does it help? The onions seem calmer. The old monk overhears this and points a muddy finger toward you both. Garlic grows better when respected. A difficult argument to refute confidently. Further along the garden wall stands the infirmary greenhouse, a low structure covered in stretched animal horn panes polished thin enough to let pale sunlight through. Inside, warmth gathers around rows of medicinal plants carefully protected from frost. Poppies, willowbark, foxglove, wormwood. Dried bundles hang overhead from wooden beams while shelves hold clay jars labelled in cramped script. The room smells wonderfully strange sweet herbs, bitter roots, damp soil, beeswax, and old smoke all tangled together. A monk named Brother Luke tends the infirmary garden with solemn concentration. His sleeves are stained green from crushed herbs while his belt carries tiny pruning knives beside a wooden spoon worn smooth by years of stirring remedies. Most people arrive wanting miracles, he says while sorting dried mint leaves. Usually they need soup. Wise man. He shows you baskets of dried plants stored for winter medicines, chamomile for fevers, sage for throats, garlic against sickness, lavender for sleep. Some swear rosemary sharpens memory, he says. Brother Aldrich snorts softly. Brother Petrus drank rosemary tea daily and still forgot where he buried the monastery keys. Those were stressful weeks. You continue through the gardens while bells ring noon across the abbey grounds. Nearby, several novices tend the beehives bundled against cold beneath straw coverings. They move carefully, reverently almost. Bees matter deeply here. Honey sweetens food. Wax makes candles. Candles light prayers, manuscripts, sick rooms, and winter nights. Even tiny insects become threads holding medieval life together once farming settles people long enough to care for them. No one can quite agree whether monasteries perfected these gardens or merely inherited generations of peasant knowledge and wrote it down more neatly. Probably both. The Abbey kitchen gardens reveal another quiet truth about farming once people stop wandering constantly. They begin cultivating not only survival, but comfort. Herbs for flavour, flowers for beauty, apples for cider, lavender for sleep, rosemary for remembrance. Humanity starts shaping the land not merely to live, but to live more gently. You help Brother Aldrich carry compost baskets toward the orchard where bare apple branches twist against the pale sky. Moss climbs the old stone walls while rooks argue noisily from the bell tower above. The monk pauses beside one ancient pear tree supported carefully with wooden braces. "This tree fed the abbey through 3 famines," he says quietly. The bark looks cracked with age. One branch hangs partly dead, yet beneath the winter light, tiny buds already gather at the tips. Waiting. Everything in farming seems built upon waiting. Waiting for thaw, waiting for rain, waiting for seedlings, waiting for harvest. Patience becomes almost a form of faith. By afternoon, clouds drift slowly over the sun while the gardens settle into peaceful winter stillness. Monks work quietly between the beds, their dark robes moving against pale stone walls and damp earth. Somewhere nearby, a novice sings softly while turning soil with a wooden spade. The sound mingles with distant bells and buzzing bees waking briefly in the weak sunlight. You sit beside the herb beds eating coarse bread spread with honey so dark it almost tastes smoky. The dog dozes nearby beneath a rosemary bush after receiving entirely too much cheese from the kitchen brothers. Brother Aldrich tears apart another piece of bread thoughtfully. "Fields feed the body," he says. "Gardens teach people to remain." You understand. The open fields sustain survival. But gardens create attachment. They turn settlements into homes. Once people plant orchards that take years to mature, they begin imagining futures rooted in one place. Children inherit trees planted by grandparents. Monasteries preserve herbs across centuries. Villages grow around wells and orchards and gardens tended long enough to become memory itself. Even now, it is hard to tell whether farming changes the land more deeply or changes the people standing upon it. The afternoon light softens toward gold while long shadows stretch across the garden walls. Monks gather tools, bees retreat again into their woven skeps. Smoke rises from the abbey kitchens, carrying the smell of onion broth and fresh bread into the cooling air. Beyond the monastery, far below in the valley, fields wait beneath fading sunlight. But here inside the stone walls, among herbs and orchard trees and humming bees, farming reveals its gentler side. Not conquest, not power, simply care repeated season after season until whole communities begin blooming around it. The bells ring once more across the quiet gardens, and beneath the fading winter sky, the abbey settles softly into evening beside the patient earth that feeds it all. Evening settles slowly over the abbey hills, spreading blue shadows across the orchards, while the last light lingers on the stone walls like dying embers. The monks move indoors one by one, carrying baskets, tools, and lanterns glowing softly through the gathering dark. Below the monastery, the valley stretches outward beneath thin winter mist. Fields, roads, villages, the river turning silver in fading light. And beyond all of it, rising from a low ridge beside the town, stands the castle. Not enormous, not one of those vast royal fortresses singers exaggerate into mountains with windows, but solid, heavy, purposeful. Its walls catch the last sunlight in dull gold while torches begin flickering along the battlements. Smoke curls upward from chimneys inside the keep. Somewhere within those walls, soldiers sharpen blades, Servants roast meat, and stewards count grain with expressions of permanent concern. Brother Aldrich notices your gaze. The Lord holds court there tonight, he says. Merchants arrive from the northern road. He pauses, and probably 3 new tax complaints. Medieval government remains wonderfully consistent. You leave the monastery after supper, following the winding road downhill toward the castle ridge. Frost begins gathering once more along the ditches, while cold wind moves through the bare hedgerows carrying the smell of smoke and distant rain. The dog trots ahead with increasing confidence, as though it personally owns the valley by now. As you climb toward the castle gate, the sounds of the settlement below fade behind you. Wagon creaks soften into silence. The mill wheel becomes a distant murmur beside the river. Only the wind and the occasional bell from the abbey drift through the dark. Ahead, the castle walls rise higher than they first appeared from the valley. Torchlight flickers across damp stone. A watchman leans over the gatehouse, chewing something with profound disapproval. Probably turnips. You pass beneath the raised portcullis into the outer bailey where life continues despite the hour. Stable boys carry armfuls of hay toward the horse lines. Servants haul barrels through the mud. Chickens somehow remain awake and offended by everything. Near the kitchens, 2 guards argue about whether cabbage soup weakens courage before battle. One insists proper warriors require beef. The other points out the castle's soldiers eat cabbage most days and remain perfectly capable of losing tempers. The argument appears unresolved. Inside the inner ward, the keep rises above the courtyard with narrow windows glowing warm against the night. You step through heavy oak doors into a great chamber far grander than the manor hall from earlier in your journey. Not luxurious by later standards, perhaps, but impressive enough. Stone pillars support timber rafters darkened by smoke and centuries of winter fires. Bright tapestries hang along the walls showing hunts, saints, and battles in which everyone appears astonishingly clean. Iron chandeliers glow overhead with dozens of beeswax candles while servants move silently through the hall carrying trenchers, wine cups, and baskets of fresh bread. Fresh bread? Always bread. Even castles smell faintly of baking grain. The lord sits at the high table surrounded by retainers, merchants, and visiting knights wrapped in fur-lined cloaks. Scribes bend nearby over parchment rolls recording taxes, shipments, and obligations owed from villages scattered across the valley. You notice immediately what fills those records. Not heroic victories, not noble speeches, grain tallies, livestock counts, mill revenues, field disputes. Farming sits quietly underneath every stone in the castle. A steward passes carrying iron keys larger than your hand. Granary keys, the true crown jewels of winter. No one can quite agree whether medieval lords ruled through swords or through control of food supplies. But hungry soldiers rarely defend walls for long. You settle near one side of the hall beside several retainers, warming themselves near a roaring hearth. Their boots steam gently from melted frost, while one sharpens a dagger with slow methodical strokes against a whetstone. Roads north are poor, a merchant says nearby. Too much rain ruined autumn grain transport. Another replies immediately, then prices rise by spring. The knights listen carefully. Even warriors track harvests because horses require oats, armies require bread, and castles require taxes collected from working fields. Without farming, these walls become empty stone very quickly. Servants bring supper in steady waves, thick pottage, roasted onions, hard cheese, smoked trout, trenchers piled with dark rye loaves. At the high table sits a roasted boar surrounded by apples preserved from autumn storage. The boar looks only slightly more cheerful than the tax collectors. A musician plays softly near the hearth while conversation rolls through the chamber. Discussions of border disputes drift easily into worries over winter wheat. Hunting rights become arguments over grazing land. Military planning becomes calculations about grain reserves. Because once humanity settles beside fields, power itself changes shape. Kings no longer rule merely people. They rule harvests, storage, roads, mills, rivers carrying grain barges, fields feeding towns. Civilization becomes rooted in land productivity as much as swords. You wander briefly toward the castle kitchens where heat billows outward in waves strong enough to erase winter entirely for several glorious moments. Bakers work beside huge ovens sliding loaves in and out with long wooden paddles, while cooks stir cauldrons thick with cabbage and barley. The smell alone could restore morale after minor warfare. One baker wipes flour from his beard and nods toward the towering bread racks. "Castle eats 200 loaves on feast days," he says proudly. You try imagining the fields required for that. The plough teams, the mill wheels, the grain wagons, the storage barns, an entire countryside working quietly so a fortress can remain warm and fed through winter. Even now, it's hard to tell whether castles protect the fields or exist because the fields became valuable enough to defend. Perhaps both truths grow together. Outside the kitchens, servants stack firewood beneath covered sheds while snow clouds gather faintly beyond the walls. A blacksmith hammers horseshoes beside the stable yard because cavalry mounts consume iron and grain with almost equal enthusiasm. Everything here depends on farming indirectly. The soldiers eat because peasants plant. The horses charge because oats grow. The candles burn because bees survive monastery gardens. The walls stand because harvest taxes paid masons and labourers. The entire castle rises from furrows cut through muddy earth by exhausted villagers far below. You return to the hall where the evening deepens beneath candlelight and smoke. One elderly knight tells stories about campaigns fought decades earlier. "We lost more men to spoiled grain than arrows," he mutters. Nobody laughs. Because everyone here understands. A starving castle falls eventually. A hungry army scatters. Food wins wars long before battles begin. Near midnight, the hall quiets gradually as merchants retire toward guest chambers and servants clear trenches into baskets for tomorrow's pottage. Outside, frost silvers the battlements beneath a dark sky crowded with stars. You step briefly onto the wall walk overlooking the sleeping valley below. From here you can see nearly everything. The monastery lanterns glowing softly among orchard trees. The town clustered beside the river. The mill wheel turning faintly in darkness. Scattered cottage fires along muddy lanes. And beyond all of it, the open fields lying pale beneath moonlight and frost. Quiet. Motionless. Yet more powerful than the castle towering above them. Because without those fields, none of this survives. Not the walls, not the bells, not the markets, not the soldiers wrapped in fur beside roaring hearths. The wind moves cold along the battlements while distant bells drift upward from the abbey. And beneath the winter stars the castle stands watch over the farmland that truly sustains it all. The castle sleeps uneasily. Even before dawn, footsteps echo through the corridors while servants stir kitchen fires back to life and guards stamp warmth into frozen feet atop the battlements. Somewhere below the keep, a horse kicks angrily against its stall door. Somewhere above, wind groans through narrow arrow slits like distant voices crossing the stone. You wake beneath a wool blanket in a guest chamber cold enough to remind you that medieval castles were designed mainly to survive sieges, not provide comfort. Frost feathers the inside edges of the shuttered window. Your breath hangs pale in the dark. The dog, meanwhile, sleeps perfectly well. Naturally, you descend toward the kitchens, following the smell of baking bread and onion broth through winding corridors lit by dim lanterns. Servants move constantly around you, carrying buckets, sacks, firewood, and messages delivered with the grim urgency of people who understand breakfast delays may lead directly to rebellion. Near the hearth, Brother Aldrich waits wrapped in his cloak, warming his hands around a cup of weak ale heated with herbs. "The reeve rides out today," he says. "Villages farther east hold winter court. You join him near the fire while bakers pull fresh loaves from the ovens. Steam curls upward through the smoky air. Somewhere nearby, scribes already scratch figures onto parchment rolls documenting rents, livestock, and seed reserves from surrounding hamlets. Every page smells faintly of farming. Outside the castle walls, dawn slowly reveals the valley beneath drifting mist. Frost glitters across the open fields like pale ash. Smoke rises from cottages tucked along muddy lanes. The monastery bell rolls through the morning cold, answered faintly by smaller church bells farther away. The reeve finally appears in the courtyard mounted on a broad grey horse that looks emotionally exhausted by bureaucracy. Several guards accompany him carrying spears and ledger satchels, protected beneath waxed cloth. You follow the small procession down from the castle ridge toward the eastern villages. The road winds between hedgerows stiff with frost while ravens circle overhead, against a sky slowly brightening from iron grey toward pale silver. Fields spread endlessly around you now, stretching farther than before into low hills and frozen meadows. Winter strips everything simple. No thick summer grain. No green pasture. Only bare earth, stubble, fences, and smoke. And somehow that makes the truth easier to see. The world here is built from fields. Every road leads between them. Every village depends upon them. Every argument returns eventually to them. The reeve rides mostly in silence, except when stopping to inspect boundary markers, or question farmers already working despite the cold. One old man repairs a collapsed drainage ditch with hands wrapped in strips of cloth against the frost. "Water stood too long here last spring," he explains. "Killed half the beans." The reeve nods immediately and makes notes. A dead drainage ditch today becomes empty granaries later. That is how medieval thinking works. Farming teaches people to notice small causes leading toward enormous consequences months afterward. You continue eastward past isolated cottages where women spread flax fibres to dry beside smoky fires. Children carry buckets of grain to chickens scratching beneath lean-to shelters. An old shepherd leads thin winter sheep across frozen pasture land while muttering constantly at them as though disappointed personally by ovine decision-making. No one can quite agree whether shepherds talk to sheep for company, or because sheep genuinely require lectures. Probably both. By midday you reach a village gathered around a muddy green beside a shallow stream. Timber cottages lean close together beneath thatched roofs patched with moss and straw. A blacksmith's hammer rings steadily through the cold air, while villagers gather near the manor barn carrying baskets, records, sacks of grain, and deeply practiced expressions of concern. Winter court. The reeve dismounts before a long wooden table set beneath a rough awning beside the barn. Scribes unpack inkhorns and parchment. Villagers line up immediately. And once again, farming reveals how deeply it reshapes human life. Because settled fields create laws. Laws create records. Records create obligations. Civilization begins piling itself atop harvests like stones atop old foundations. One by one, the villagers present disputes and reports. A boundary hedge moved during autumn flooding. A shared plough team needing repair. A widow requesting reduced rent after illness ruined her harvest. Two brothers arguing over grazing rights so passionately you briefly fear actual combat involving turnips. The reeve listens patiently through all of it while scribes record every detail. Grain owed, labour promised, seed shortages, livestock counts. Even now, it is hard to tell whether medieval villages survive through cooperation or through everyone being too busy farming to sustain full-time feuds, though they certainly try. You wander briefly toward the edge of the green where several elderly villagers sit beside a low fire warming their hands around clay cups of hot broth. One old woman watches the court proceedings with deep suspicion. In my grandmother's time, she says, families wandered more. Before farming, you ask. She shrugs slowly. Not before farming entirely, but before everything became counted. That thought lingers with you. Farming gives stability, but also measurement. Fields divided, harvests tallied, taxes calculated, boundaries fixed into memory and law. Human life becomes rooted not only physically, but administratively. A dangerous development, perhaps. The old woman points toward the surrounding hills. Still, she says quietly, people buried fewer children once grain stores improved. And there it is again. The bargain underneath everything. Farming complicates life enormously, yet it also allows more life to continue. By afternoon, clouds drift across the valley carrying the promise of snow. Villagers hurry through remaining business before the weather turns. Near the stream, several women wash wool beside stones glazed with thin ice, while nearby children gather fallen branches for kindling. The reeve finally closes the records and seals them with wax beside the fire. Another season documented, another village measured against the needs of survival. You help load the parchment satchels back onto the horses while snowflakes begin drifting lazily through the air. Small flakes, soft flakes, the kind that hush the world gently rather than threaten it. The villagers retreat toward warm cottages carrying bread, firewood, and tomorrow's worries home through the deepening cold. Brother Aldrich watches them disappear into the twilight. Funny thing, he murmurs. People imagine civilization arrives through great victories. Snow gathers slowly on the fields around you, but most of it arrives through repeated harvests. Repeated harvests. That truly may be the heart of it all. Not one miraculous season. Not sudden abundance. Just enough successful years strung together for people to remain in one place long enough to build roads, laws, churches, castles, gardens, mills, and memories. The snow thickens slightly as evening settles across the valley. Smoke rises blue from cottage chimneys while bells ring faintly through the darkening air. Somewhere far behind you, the castle waits above its fields. Somewhere ahead, monasteries guard seed grain and orchard trees through winter. And beneath the fresh snow, hidden now from sight entirely, lie the countless furrows that quietly changed humanity forever. Snow continues through the night. Not heavily, just enough to soften the roads, the rooftops, the hedgerows, the wagon ruts, and all the hard edges of the valley beneath a pale white hush. By dawn the world feels quieter, as though winter itself has placed a careful hand over everything. You wake in the village guest house wrapped in wool blankets while the fire sinks low beside the hearth. Outside, bells drift through the morning darkness from somewhere beyond the snowy fields. Slow bells, patient bells. The kind that seem to measure not hours, but lives. The dog lifts its head briefly, decides nothing urgent is happening, and returns to sleep with professional confidence. You rise and step outside into the cold. Snow creaks beneath your boots. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys into a pearl-grey sky. Along the lane, villagers move softly through the morning carrying buckets, baskets, and armfuls of wood against their chests. No one rushes. The snow slows everything into gentleness. Even the chickens seem thoughtful. You walk beyond the cottages toward the fields one final time. The valley stretches silent beneath the winter light. Fences wear thin white lines along their tops. Bare orchards stand motionless beside frozen paths. The river moves dark beneath drifting mist while the mill wheel turns slowly beside its banks, patient as ever. Far away, the castle rises above the ridge. Beyond it, faint through snow haze, the monastery bell tower waits among orchard walls and sleeping gardens. Everything you have seen remains here together now. The fields, the mills, the roads, the granaries, the churches, the halls, the bridges, the markets, all resting quietly upon the same ancient agreement between people and the earth. You follow the snowy path toward a low watchfire burning near the edge of the common fields. Someone has left rough benches there beside a shelter of woven branches facing east across the valley. A farmer sits beside the fire warming his hands around a heel of bread. He nods as you approach and breaks the loaf carefully in half before handing you a piece. Simple rye bread. Dark. Dense. Still faintly warm from the ovens. You sit beside him without speaking for a while. The fire crackles softly. Snow drifts lazily from the pale sky. Somewhere far off, a raven calls once across the fields, and slowly, almost without noticing it happen, you begin understanding the full shape of the story you have walked through. Humanity did not change all at once. No shining moment announced it. No king stood upon a hill declaring that fields would replace wandering roads forever. Instead, people planted seeds, then planted them again, and again, one season at a time, one valley at a time, one muddy furrow at a time. At first, perhaps they only hoped for easier winters, a little less hunger, fewer desperate journeys through cold forests searching for food. But farming did something stranger than merely feeding people. It persuaded them to stay. And once people stayed, everything else followed quietly behind. A path became a road became a market became a town, a shrine became a church, a hall became a castle, a garden became a monastery orchard blooming across generations. Children inherited fields their grandparents once cleared by hand. Villages learned the shape of local seasons. Bells marked shared time. Laws grew around boundaries and harvests. Memory rooted itself in one place, deeply enough to survive winter after winter. Even the dead remain nearby now, resting beneath village soil beside the same fields that fed the living. The farmer beside you tears another piece from the loaf. No one leaves land easily once it feeds them, he says quietly. His words drift into the cold air like smoke. Across the valley, morning slowly brightens. You can see tiny figures moving already near the distant barns. Someone carries firewood across a yard. Someone checks sheep beside a hedge. Someone opens a granary door hidden beneath frost. The endless rhythm continues. Not dramatic, not glorious, simply steady. That may be why farming changed the world more completely than war ever could. War destroys quickly. Farming transforms slowly enough that generations barely notice it happening. Until suddenly there are walls, written records, kings, taxes, mills turning beside rivers, pilgrim roads crossing continents, candles burning in monastery windows while scribes preserve knowledge through the dark. All because human beings once trusted the earth enough to bury food in it and wait. The snow eases gradually. Clouds thin overhead. A pale ribbon of sunlight spreads across the open fields, touching the frozen furrows beneath their white covering. You think about the widow planting barley into cold soil, about the monks guarding seed jars beside candlelight, about the mill wheel grinding grain into flour while villagers waited with empty sacks, about crowded alehouses glowing warm because barley became bread and drink enough to spare an evening. All those small ordinary things. Civilization, it turns out, is mostly ordinary things repeated faithfully. The farmer eventually rises, brushing snow from his cloak. Storm will clear by tomorrow, he says. Good for spring moisture. Then he walks back toward the village, carrying the remaining bread beneath his arm. You remain beside the watchfire a little longer. The wind softens. The bells ring once more across the valley, and the medieval world around you begins settling into stillness. Smoke drifts upward from distant chimneys in slow blue lines. The castle fades slightly into pale mist. The monastery gardens sleep beneath snow. The roads lie quiet. The mill wheel turns and turns beside the dark river. Everything feels dimmer now. Softer. Warmer somehow despite the cold. You pull your cloak tighter around yourself while the fire sinks into glowing embers. The fields stretch endlessly beneath winter light, peaceful at last beneath their blanket of snow. Hidden under that silence rests every future harvest waiting patiently for spring. And beneath those future harvests rests every village, every bell, every loaf of bread, every sheltering roof, every memory carried through generations by people who learned, long ago, to remain beside the land instead of wandering away from it. The world grows quieter. The bells become distant. The smoke thins into the pale sky. And slowly, gently, the valley drifts towards sleep around you. You watch the last sparks rise from the watchfire into the cold morning air until even they disappear. Then there is only the soft snow, the sleeping fields, and the long, quiet breath of the medieval world resting at last in darkness.